What if I told you that 25 years before Dracula ever stepped foot in Transylvania, there was already a vampire stalking the pages of literature? One who was elegant, seductive, and utterly terrifying in ways that Bram Stoker would later borrow from. And what if I told you that this vampire wasn't some caped count, but a beautiful young woman whose story became one of the earliest examples of sapphic horror in literature? Hi, I'm Ridhima. Welcome to the Old Trunk. I'm absolutely thrilled to dive into today's discussion because we're talking about a book that completely shook me in the best possible way. This is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, published in 1872, and let me just say up front, this was my very first sapphic horror story. And what an introduction it was. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's talk about why Carmilla deserves a place on your TBR pile and in the canon of essential Gothic literature. Before I dive into the story itself, I want to talk about why I picked up Carmilla in the first place. I'd been keen on this kick of reading foundational horror texts going back to the sources that influenced everything we read today. I was doing my research on Dracula for Gothic horror books when I kept seeing Carmilla mentioned in academic papers and horror literature discussions. The thing that kept coming up was how Le Fanu's work predated and influenced Stoker's more famous vampire novel. Published a full 25 years before Dracula, Carmilla established so many of the vampire tropes we take for granted today. But what really caught my attention was the mention of the relationship between two female protagonists and how groundbreaking it was for its time. Now, I have to be honest with you all, I went into this expecting something much more tame than what I got. This is Victorian literature, and I thought the sapphic element might be so coded and subtle that I need to use my literature degree to catch them. I was so wrong. Le Fanu was bold in ways that still feel revolutionary today. And he was writing this in an era when such themes were not just controversial but potentially career-ending. The historical context here is crucial. We're talking about the 1870s, during the height of the Victorian era, when women's roles were strictly defined and any deviation from heteronormative relationships was not just frowned upon, but literally illegal in some cases. Yet here's Le Fanu writing a story that places female desire, specifically desire between women, at the absolute center of his narrative. What's so fascinating is that Le Fanu was Irish, and he was writing during a period when Ireland was under the British rule, dealing with issues of identity, colonization, and otherness. Some scholars argue that you can read Carmilla as a metaphor for the colonial relationship between Ireland and Britain, with the vampire representing the invasive foreign presence. Whether or not Le Fanu intended this reading, it adds another layer to an already complex work. The story was originally published as part of a collection called In a Glass Darkly. And it's worth noting that Le Fanu was already an established writer of ghost stories and supernatural fiction. He had a reputation for psychological horror and atmosphere, which absolutely shows in Carmilla. This isn't just a vampire story, it's a masterclass in building dread and tension. Alright, let's talk about the story itself. And I promise to keep this spoiler free for the major plot points while giving you enough to understand what you're getting into. Carmilla is narrated by Laura, a young woman living in an isolated castle in Styria. That's in modern day Austria, with her father who's English and their small household staff. Laura's life is quiet, perhaps even lonely. She's educated, she reads, she takes walks, but she's quite isolated from society. Her mother died when she was young, and her father, while loving, is often preoccupied with his own pursuits. The story opens with Laura recounting a strange experience from her childhood, a dream or vision of a woman, of a beautiful woman, who seemed to visit her in the night. This sets up the Gothic dreamlike atmosphere that permeates the entire novella. Le Fanu immediately establishes that we're in a world where the boundaries between dream and reality, between the natural and the supernatural, are blurred. The main action kicks off when Laura and her father witness a carriage accident near their home. From this accident emerges Carmilla, a young woman roughly Laura's age who is beautiful, mysterious, and apparently in need of care. Due to circumstances I won't spoil, Carmilla ends up staying at the castle as Laura's guest. And this is where the real story begins. What follows is the development of an intense relationship between Laura and Carmilla. Laura, who has been starved for companionship her age, is immediately drawn to this sophisticated, worldly young woman. Carmilla is everything Laura isn't. Confident, sensual, experienced. She speaks multiple languages, she's well traveled, and she has an almost hypnotic presence. But Carmilla is also strange. She sleeps late into the day, she has peculiar dietary requirements, she seems to know things she shouldn't know. And she has an intensity about her that both attracts and unsettles Laura. Their relationship develops rapidly, with Carmilla expressing affection for Laura in ways that are far more physical and passionate than typical friendships of that era. As their relationship deepens, strange things begin happening around the castle and the surrounding area. There are reports of a mysterious illness affecting young women in nearby villages. Laura herself begins experiencing strange dreams, feelings of weakness, and an overall sense of something that is not quite right, even as she finds herself increasingly drawn to Carmilla. The beauty of Le Fanu's plotting is how he builds this sense of unease gradually. For much of the story, you're not entirely sure what's happening. Is Carmilla simply an unusual but harmless young woman? Is Laura's attraction to her clouding her judgment? Are the strange occurrences coincidental? Or is there something more sinister at play? Le Fanu masterfully uses Laura's first-person narrative to keep us in the same state of confusion and attraction that she experiences. We see everything through her eyes, and Laura herself is conflicted. She's drawn to Carmilla but also frightened by her. She enjoys their intimate moments but is disturbed by Carmilla's intensity. This creates a reading experience where you're constantly questioning what's real and what might be psychological. The structure of the novella is also worth mentioning. It's relatively short and you can easily read it in one sitting, but Le Fanu packs an incredible amount of atmosphere and character development into those pages. The pacing is deliberate, almost languid at times, which mirrors the dreamlike quality of Laura's experience but also builds tension as strange events accumulate. Without giving anything away, I can tell you that the story builds to revelations about Carmilla's true nature and the source of the mysterious illness plaguing the area. These revelations reframe everything that came before and cast Laura's entire experience in a new light. The ending brings together supernatural horror, emotional devastation, and social commentary in a way that's both satisfying and deeply unsettling. Now let's deep dive into our characters, starting with our narrator, Laura. She's one of the most fascinating protagonists I've encountered in Gothic literature, and I think Le Fanu deserves credit for creating such a complex, believable young woman. Laura is 19 when the main events of the story take place, and she's telling this story as an older woman looking back. This retrospective narration is crucial because it means we're getting Laura's adult perspective on events she experienced as a teenager, with all the complexity that entails. She's simultaneously the innocent girl who lived through those events and the mature woman who understands their implications. What strikes me most about Laura is how she feels as a character. She's not the typical Gothic heroine who's either purely innocent or purely corrupted. Instead, she's genuinely curious, intelligent, and capable of growth. She reads extensively. We see her discussing literature and philosophy, and she's observant about the world around her. But she's also isolated and hungry for connection in ways that make her vulnerable. Her isolation is key to understanding her character arc. She lives in this castle with her father, who loves her but doesn't really understand her inner life, and a handful of servants. She has no friends her age, no romantic prospects, no real social life. When Carmilla arrives, she represents everything Laura has been missing: companionship, intellectual stimulation, emotional intensity, and yes, physical affection. Laura's response to Carmilla is beautifully complex. She's immediately attracted to her, but she's also troubled by the intensity of her own feelings. Remember, this is the 1870s, and Laura would have had very little framework for understanding same sex attraction. She describes her feelings in language that's both passionate and confused. She talks about loving Carmilla but also being frightened by her own emotions. What I find particularly brilliant about Le Fanu's characterization is how he shows Laura's internal conflict without ever making her seem weak or foolish. She's not a victim in the traditional sense. She makes choices, even if she doesn't fully understand their consequences. When she notices strange things about Carmilla, she doesn't just dismiss them. She observes, she questions, she tries to understand. But she's also emotionally invested in a way that clouds her judgment. Laura's relationship with her sexuality is fascinating to analyze. Through her interactions with Carmilla, we see her discovering desires and feelings she didn't know she had. Le Fanu writes these scenes with remarkable sensitivity for the era. Laura's confusion and awakening feel authentic rather than exploitative. She's not punished for her desires in a way many Victorian novels would punish a woman who stepped outside conventional bounds. The retrospective narration adds another layer here, because we understand that adult Laura is looking back at her younger self with both compassion and understanding. She doesn't shame her younger self for being attracted to Carmilla or for the choices she made. Instead, she presents this as part of her formation as a person. Laura's intelligence is also worth highlighting. She's not just a passive victim of supernatural forces. Throughout the story, she's trying to piece together what's happening. She notices inconsistencies in Carmilla's stories. She pays attention to the timing of various events, and she asks questions even when she doesn't like the potential answers. This makes her a much more engaging narrator than if she was simply an innocent being manipulated. Her relationship with her father is another crucial aspect of her character. They clearly love each other, but there's also a generational and gender gap that prevents full understanding. Her father sees her as his little girl who needs protection, while Laura is becoming a young woman with her own desires and agency. This tension adds to her isolation and makes Carmilla's arrival even more significant. One thing that really struck me is how Laura processes trauma. Without spoiling anything, I can say that Laura experiences events that would be deeply traumatic, but Le Fanu shows her as someone who survives, processes, and ultimately integrates these experiences into her understanding of herself and the world. She's not broken by what happens to her. She's changed, certainly, but she retains her agency and her voice. Laura's voice as a narrator is also worth analyzing. She tells the story in a conversational, almost intimate tone, as if she's confiding in a close friend. This creates a sense of trust between her and the reader, which makes the story's revelations more impactful. We feel like we know Laura personally, which means we're emotionally invested in her journey. Now let's talk about Carmilla herself, because she is absolutely one of the most compelling characters in Gothic literature, and I would argue one of the most influential vampire characters ever created. First, let's talk about what makes Carmilla unique among vampire characters, especially considering this predates Dracula by 25 years. Carmilla isn't a count in a castle or an obviously monstrous figure. She's a young woman, beautiful and sophisticated, who could easily pass for normal aristocracy. This was revolutionary for vampire fiction at the time and established a template that we still see in modern vampire stories. But what really sets Carmilla apart is her emotional complexity. She's not simply a predator, though she is that. She's also capable of genuine affection, longing, and even what might be love. Her relationship with Laura isn't purely manipulative. There are moments where Carmilla seems as surprised by the intensity of her feelings as Laura is. Le Fanu presents Carmilla as someone who exists between categories. She's dead but not dead, foreign but familiar, dangerous but appealing. This ambiguity is what makes her so fascinating and terrifying. Traditional Gothic villains are often clearly evil. You know who the bad guy is. Carmilla challenges that binary by being someone who can simultaneously care for Laura and harm her. Her dialogue is particularly worth analyzing. Carmilla speaks in a way that's both passionate and slightly archaic, suggesting her age and origins without being heavy-handed about it. She's eloquent, well-educated, and charismatic. When she speaks about love and desire, her language is more direct and physical than anything Laura would have encountered in her sheltered life. This linguistic difference emphasizes the gap in their experience and worldliness. The physical descriptions of Carmilla are also fascinating. Le Fanu emphasizes her beauty, but it's a beauty that's slightly otherworldly. She's pale, her movements are graceful to an almost unnatural degree. And there's something about her presence that's captivating in a way that goes beyond mere attractiveness. Characters in the story frequently comment on feeling drawn to her without being able to explain why. Carmilla's relationship with time and history is another crucial aspect of her character. She occasionally lets slip references that suggest she's much older than she appears, and there are hints throughout the story that she's lived through historical events that would predate Laura's lifetime. This gives her a sense of gravitas and mystery that adds to her appeal. What's particularly interesting is how Carmilla relates to other people beyond Laura. She's charming when she needs to be, but there's also a sense that she finds most people boring or beneath her interest. Laura is special to her in some way, which makes their relationship more complex than simple predator prey dynamics. The question whether Carmilla truly loves Laura or is simply using her is one that Le Fanu deliberately leaves ambiguous. I think this ambiguity is part of what makes the character so enduring. There are moments where Carmilla's affection seems genuine, where she appears to be struggling with her own nature and her feelings for Laura. But there are also moments where her predatory nature is unmistakable. Carmilla's backstory, when it's revealed, adds another layer to her character without fully explaining her. We learn about her origins, but much about her remains mysterious. This is smart writing because it maintains her otherworldly quality while giving us enough information to understand the stakes of the story. Her relationship with sexuality is also groundbreaking for the time period. Carmilla is openly sensual and physical in ways that Victorian women weren't supposed to be. She touches Laura casually. She speaks about physical desire directly and is comfortable with her own body and appetites. This would have been shocking to Victorian readers and remains compelling today. Le Fanu also uses Carmilla to explore themes of foreignness and otherness. She's clearly not from Laura's world. She speaks multiple languages, references places Laura's never been, and has customs and habits that seem strange. In the context of Victorian England, this foreignness would have been both exotic and threatening. One aspect of Carmilla that often gets overlooked in discussions of the character is her apparent loneliness. There are moments in the story where she seems genuinely isolated and sad, as if her supernatural nature has cut her off from meaningful connection with others. This makes her attachment to Laura more poignant and adds tragedy to her character. The influence of Carmilla on later vampire fiction cannot be overstated. The seductive, beautiful vampire who can pass for human. The idea of vampirism as both curse and liberation, the connection between vampirism and sexuality, all of these elements that we associate with modern vampire fiction can be traced back to Le Fanu. But beyond her influence on the genre, Carmilla works as a character because she represents something that's both desired and feared. She offers Laura's experiences and feelings she's never had before, but at a cost that becomes increasingly clear as the story progresses. She's freedom and danger combined, which makes her irresistible even as she becomes more obviously threatening. Le Fanu's writing style is absolutely crucial to why Carmilla works so effectively. Because his writing was masterful and way ahead of his time in many respects. First, let's talk about his use of first-person retrospective narration. Having Laura tell the story as an older woman, looking back creates multiple layers of meaning and interpretation. We're not just getting the immediate experience of a 19-year-old girl. We're getting that experience filtered through the understanding of an adult woman who has had time to process and reflect on what happened to her. This is Gothic literature at its finest. He uses setting, weather, time of day, and sensory details to create an environment where supernatural events feel not just possible but inevitable. What's really impressive is how Le Fanu builds atmosphere through small realistic details rather than over-the-top Gothic theatrics. His pacing deserves particular praise. Carmilla is a relatively short work, but Le Fanu never rushes the development of the relationship between Laura and Carmilla. He takes time to show us how their connection deepens, how Laura's feelings evolve, and how the supernatural elements gradually intrude into what initially seems like a straightforward story of friendship and attraction. The dialogue in Carmilla is remarkably naturalistic for Victorian literature. When Laura and Carmilla talk, their conversations feel like real exchanges between two intelligent young women, not like formal Victorian discourse. Le Fanu's handling of sexuality and desire is particularly skillful. He's writing in an era when explicit discussion of any kind of sexuality was taboo. And same sex desire was not just controversial but literally unspeakable. Yet he manages to convey the intensity and physicality of Laura and Carmilla's relationship without ever crossing the lines of what was publishable at the time. He does this through implication, through emotional intensity, and through physical descriptions that are sensual without being explicit. The psychological realism in Carmilla is also worth highlighting. Laura's confusion about her own feelings, her attraction mixed with unease, her attempts to rationalize strange events, all of this feels psychologically authentic. Le Fanu understands how people actually think and feel, especially when they're experiencing something outside their normal range of experience. His use of dreams and the boundary between sleeping and waking is particularly effective. This blurring of boundaries perfectly supports the supernatural element while also reflecting the psychological state of characters who are dealing with experiences they can't fully understand. Le Fanu also employs what I'd call strategic ambiguity. He gives us enough information to understand what's happening, while leaving enough explained to maintain mystery and allow for multiple interpretations. This is particularly effective with Carmilla herself. We learn enough about her to understand the basic facts of her situation, but much about her remains mysterious and open to interpretation. His descriptive writing deserves mention too. Le Fanu has a gift for creating vivid scenes without overwriting. His descriptions of the Austrian countryside, the castle interiors, and the characters themselves are specific enough to be visualizable, but not so detailed as to slow down the narrative pace. The thematic depth of Carmilla is part of what makes it such an enduring work. Le Fanu is working with themes that were controversial in his time and remain relevant today. And he handles them with a sophistication that's remarkable for any era. The theme of isolation and connection runs throughout the story. Le Fanu seems to be commenting on how isolation can make people susceptible to unhealthy relationships, but also on how the human need for connection is so strong that it can override rational caution. Laura's story suggests that complete isolation isn't protective. It can actually be dangerous because it leaves people unprepared for complex relationships and situations. The theme of foreignness and otherness is also significant. The idea of the foreign presence that seems appealing but is ultimately dangerous could certainly be read as a metaphor for colonial relationships. But I think the theme works on a more universal level too. Carmilla represents everything that's unfamiliar and potentially threatening about the wider world that Laura has been sheltered from. This speaks to broader anxieties about exposure to foreign influences and ideas. The theme of knowledge and innocence is also central to the story. Laura begins the story relatively innocent and sheltered, but her relationship with Carmilla forces her to confront aspects of herself and the world that she never knew existed. This coming-of-age element gives the story emotional weight beyond its supernatural plot. But Le Fanu doesn't present this loss of innocence as purely negative. Laura gains self-knowledge and understanding, even if it comes at a cost. She becomes more aware of her own desires and capabilities. And while her experiences are traumatic, they also contribute to her growth as a person. Understanding Carmilla's place in literary history really enhances appreciation for what Le Fanu accomplished with this novella. When we talk about vampire fiction, most people immediately think of Dracula, but Carmilla established many of the conventions that we now associate with vampire literature. Carmilla came out during a period when supernatural fiction was becoming increasingly popular, but most vampire stories up to that point were more folkloric and less psychologically sophisticated. Le Fanu created what was essentially the template for the modern literary vampire: attractive, seductive, psychologically complex, and capable of genuine emotion rather than being simply monstrous. Le Fanu's technique of building horror through psychological realism and atmospheric detail rather than through explicit violence or shock tactics became influential for later horror writers. The story also pioneered the use of female centered horror narratives. While there were certainly Gothic novels with female protagonists before Carmilla, Le Fanu's focus on the internal experience of his female narrator and his sympathetic treatment of her desires and agency was relatively unusual for the time. Now, I want to share my personal response to Carmilla, because this book affected me in ways I wasn't expecting. And I think my reaction speaks to why the story remains so powerful more than 150 years after it was written. First, I have to talk about how surprised I was by the boldness of the story. As I mentioned earlier, I went in expecting something much more coded and subtle since this is Victorian literature. And I thought the sapphic elements would be buried in metaphors and implications. Instead, Le Fanu presents Laura and Carmilla's relationship with an emotional and physical directness that still feels bold today. Le Fanu found a way to write about same-sex desire openly while still making it publishable in his era. And that's a remarkable achievement. The horror elements worked incredibly well for me, partly because they're so grounded in emotional truth. The most frightening aspects of the story aren't the supernatural elements. They're the emotional manipulation, the gradual erosion of Laura's sense of reality, the way Carmilla's influence changes Laura's understanding of herself. This feels like very modern psychological horror. I was also impressed by how Le Fanu handles the tragic elements of the story. I found myself constantly impressed by how much Le Fanu accomplishes in relatively few pages. This is a short work, but it feels complete and satisfying in a way that many longer novels don't. Every scene serves multiple purposes. Every character interaction reveals something important, and the emotional arc feels fully developed. Reading Carmilla also made me think about how much we've lost in contemporary literature by often being too explicit about everything. Le Fanu's technique of building tension and meaning through implication and atmosphere creates a reading experience that's incredibly immersive. The book made me reconsider some of my assumptions about Victorian literature and Victorian society. We often think of the Victorian era as completely repressive about sexuality, but Le Fanu's ability to publish this story suggests that there was more openness to exploring these themes than we might expect. Obviously, he had to be careful about how he presented them, but the fact that he could present them at all is significant. Finally, I have to say that this book made me want to read more Le Fanu and more early supernatural fiction in general. There's something about the way earlier writers approached the supernatural as something mysterious and genuinely otherworldly. and that feels different from a lot of contemporary supernatural fiction. Modern stories often explain everything, but Le Fanu maintains a sense of genuine mystery that makes Carmilla feel more authentically supernatural. Now let's talk about who should read Carmilla, because I think this book has appeal for several different types of readers, though it might not be for everyone. Obviously, if you're interested in LGBTQ plus literature and literary history, this book is essential reading. It's one of the earliest works to deal explicitly with same-sex desire between women, and it handles those themes with surprising sophistication and sympathy for its era. This is also crucial reading for anyone interested in vampire fiction or Gothic literature more generally. Understanding Carmilla helps you understand where so many of our modern vampire conventions come from. If you've ever wondered why vampires are sexy instead of just scary, or why vampire stories often focus on seduction and psychological manipulation rather than just violence, the answer largely traces back to Le Fanu. For readers who love atmospheric, character-driven horror, Carmilla is perfect. This isn't gory or shock value horror, it's psychological and atmospheric horror that builds tension through character development and mood rather than through explicit scares. If you prefer horror that gets under your skin rather than horror that grosses you out, you'll probably love this. I'd also recommend this to readers who are interested in Victorian literature, but find some Victorian novels too long or dense. However, I should be honest about who might not enjoy this book. If you're looking for fast-paced, action-heavy horror, Carmilla might feel slow to you. The pacing is deliberate and atmospheric, and much of the story focuses on character development and relationship building rather than supernatural action. If you have difficulty with older writing styles, you might find Le Fanu's Victorian prose challenging, though I think his style is actually quite accessible compared to some of his contemporaries. If you're someone who needs everything explained and tied up neatly, you might find Carmilla unsatisfying. Le Fanu maintains a certain level of ambiguity and mystery throughout the story, and some questions are left unanswered. This is intentional and effective for the story's themes, but it can be frustrating if you prefer more definitive resolutions. Finally, if you're looking for a light escapist read, Carmilla probably isn't for you. While it's not a difficult read, it deals with heavy themes and psychological complexity that require some emotional engagement. It's rewarding, but it's not fluffy entertainment. That said, I think most readers who are interested in literature beyond pure entertainment will find something to appreciate in Carmilla. It's a short book that packs an enormous amount of psychological insight, historical significance, and emotional power into its pages. As I wrap up this discussion, I want to emphasize why I think Carmilla deserves a place on your reading list and in conversations about essential literature. This novella is remarkable for how many things it does exceptionally well. It's a foundational work of vampire fiction that established conventions still used today. It's a groundbreaking work of LGBTQ plus literature that presented same-sex desire with unprecedented directness and sympathy for its era. It's a masterclass in atmospheric psychological horror that builds tension through character development rather than cheap scares. And it's a sophisticated exploration of female sexuality, desire, and agency in the Victorian era. But beyond its historical significance, Carmilla remains a compelling read today because it deals with universal themes in psychologically realistic ways. The story feels both of its time and timeless. What impresses me most about Carmilla is how it manages to be both entertaining and significant. This isn't just a book that's important for literary history, it's also a genuinely engaging story with compelling characters and emotional depth. You don't need to be a literature scholar to appreciate it, though literary scholars will find plenty to analyze. This is a book that was pushing boundaries in the 1870s and continues to feel relevant today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Carmilla, and if Carmilla sounds appealing to you, go read it. It's short enough to read in an evening, it's widely available in multiple formats, and it's in the public domain, so you can find free versions online. If you do read it, come back and let me know what you thought in the comments. I'd also love to hear from people who have read Carmilla before. What did you think of my analysis? Did I miss anything important? Are there aspects of the story that you think deserve more attention? If you enjoyed this review, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and press that bell icon so that you get notified of whenever I upload a new video. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay happy. Thanks for watching. Lots of love. Bye-bye.